presentation of the situation in Romania, and also the encouraging signs that the government is both aware of the situation and taking initiatives in order to deal with the situation, and also for the clarity around migration and mobility, which I think is a very important issue that we need to address. And certainly when we had the first meeting, we had presentations from different countries. The situation of children left behind in countries outside the European Union was quite different. The regularity of visits and the difficulty of parental contact was on a different scale to that of those who are travelling within the European Union. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Margaret, who is the Coordinator for Children's Rights in DG Justice of the European Commission.
And thank you to the conference organisers for organising this meeting here today and raising the topic. We are very much aware of the issue in the Commission, and I'd just like to make a few points on the EU perspective and what we're doing. A lot of what I'll say will relate to DG Employment and not DG Justice, because in a way they are doing more in this area. We have the EU Agenda for the Rights of the Child that was adopted in February 2011, and the EU Agenda placed particular emphasis on children when they are vulnerable. So that includes children growing up in poverty and social exclusion, and referred to the recommendation that was adopted in February. To look at the larger context, it's worth recalling Article 18 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which underlines the fact that parents have joint and common responsibilities for the upbringing and development of the child, and that the best interests of the child will be their basic concern. And I think we could speak more about the nurturing role of parents. It's not only about the material well-being, but there's a lot more to being a parent. And furthermore, Article 18 requires states parties to render appropriate assistance to parents and legal guardians in the performance of their child-rearing roles. So state parties are required to take appropriate measures to ensure that children of working parents have the right to benefit from childcare services for which they are eligible, among others. With regard to the phenomenon of children left behind, we know that it's a global one, not only a European one, as parents move for work. And if you look at the CRIN website, the Child Rights Information Network, International Network, they changed their name, International Network, I think. There's, for example, a Save the Children study on Sri Lanka, and there were a few books by Ehrenreich, one called Global Women and another called Nickel and Dimed, which focused on especially the issue of mothers moving for work and being in low-skilled, usually domestic and care jobs abroad, and not perhaps seeing their children for years. So it is an issue. We know that in Europe the figures are rising. We have, if you look at the Europe 2020 headline indicators, you can see a steep increase in record highs in the numbers of people at risk of poverty and social exclusion. This is one of the main drivers for people to move in search of work. I know in my own country, Ireland, more and more people are moving for work as well. They tend to go further afield to Australia and the States, but a lot of people are moving. The risks to which children left behind are exposed should be further assessed. They're not all at risk if they're left in good care. It's the parents' responsibility to make sure they are left in good care. But if they're not, and we know, for example, that traffickers prey on vulnerable children, then children without adequate care and supervision are obviously more at risk. And when looking at the impact on children left behind, I think we need to focus a lot more on their participation, their views, and listen to what they have to say. For example, if we see evidence, perhaps anecdotal evidence, of behavioural difficulties among a group of children left behind, we need to measure that against a control group of similar children who enjoy adequate parental care, because even children with parental care can misbehave, so we can't always perhaps assign any difficulties to the fact that they're left behind. With regard to what the EU can do to promote their inclusion, let me tell you a bit about primarily the social investment package that was adopted on the 20th of February and includes an Investing in Children recommendation, and we look forward to the Council's discussions on it. The package sets out a framework for policy reform that emphasises investing in human capabilities. It's about helping individuals to be better prepared for and able to adapt to critical stages that arise during their life course. It's about strengthening skills and facilitating or activating participation in the labour market, the economy and society as a whole. And the recommendation calls on Member States to step up social investment targeted towards children. It explains how EU financial instruments can be better mobilised to ensure that children are given the best start in life. And the title of the recommendation says it all. It's about breaking the cycle of disadvantage and making sure that children are not locked into a life of disadvantage. The recommendation focuses on prevention rather than the cure. I think prevention is always, at the very least, cheaper than trying to cure the disease. And there's a focus on children who are even more at risk because they face multiple disadvantages. For example, Roma children or some migrant children. We know that without the necessary investment, and that word investment is broad, it's not about money, it's all senses of the word. In their upbringing and education, many children will not, as adults, achieve their full potential. And in very practical terms, every child that does not become a future taxpayer will potentially have to be supported by our welfare systems. So I think that's a pretty convincing argument if nothing else works. The recommendation highlights the importance of promoting progressive universalism and promotes a combination of universal approaches with more targeted ones for the most vulnerable. It's about ensuring access to adequate living standards by supporting parents' participation in the labour market, as well as a combination of benefits. And it proposes indicators to monitor progress. Of course, we also have indicators for Europe 2020. And there's a lot in there as well, not only about the quantity of service provision, but the quality of services. It's not only about childcare, but they have to be of a certain level of quality. Child participation and involvement are very important. Their views must be taken into consideration, not only listened to, but acted upon. And I think we are all convinced that if children are involved in the parents' decision to move abroad, if they have an active role in the discussions, if they have a choice in where they're going to live, if they have some control over their situation, it will all go much better. There's also, as part of the social investment package, a staff working document on homelessness, and children are mentioned in there as well. With regard to the structural funds, it's very important that the best possible use is made of them. There are strands on social infrastructure, including childcare facilities and early childhood education and care, and transition from institutional care to community-based care. And the future fund for European aid to the deprived focuses on providing food and clothing and other essential goods to, among others, materially deprived children. The social open method of coordination will help Member States coordinate their policy approaches and share experience in implementing the recommendation. And there will be a report from DG Justice in 2013 on implementation of the Barcelona targets on childcare. And if you don't know what they are, there was a target set in 2002 in Barcelona at the summit of the European Council for the provision of childcare by 2010 to at least 90% of children between 3 years old and the mandatory school age, and the provision of childcare to at least a third of children under the age of 3. DG Education and Culture are working on an initiative focusing on the quality of early childhood education and care, and we want to move away from only talking about the quantity, but really to focus on quality. DG Employment has launched the European Platform for Investing in Children. You can find it at europa.eu/EPIC, EPIC. And the platform has been set up to collect and disseminate innovative practices that have a positive impact on children and families in the EU. And it's there to monitor the activities triggered by the recommendation. One, I think, very good feature of it, instead of just gathering perhaps a random set of good practice, there'll be an evaluation of the practice against criteria such as transferability and sustainability to see if they really are good practice. So there'll be some sort of criteria. And EPIC will also serve as a platform to share the best of policy making for children and their families and foster cooperation and mutual learning. DG Employment will also carry out a study to map where conditional cash transfers are used in the EU and to assess their impact, which could potentially be negative or positive. In DG Justice, we're carrying out a study right now to map legislation, policy and practice on child participation in the EU member states, and the outputs will include a catalogue of resources that could be used to foster participation, and we also want to identify examples of good practice in all member states. And the voices of children affected by parents moving for work must be heard and must be taken into consideration. In the 2012 European Forum on the Rights of the Child, where the focus was on how implementation of the EU agenda could support member states' child protection systems, needs were identified with regard to interagency and interdepartmental coordination, the need to gather better evidence on intervention models that actually work and then promote them, and the importance of non-formal actors in child protection, namely the role of the family, the extended family, and the community as a whole. And in follow-up to that forum, we're looking at how the EU could possibly contribute to the preventive role of child protection systems. This is bearing in mind, of course, that member states have competence for child protection, not the EU. While we should and must focus on prevention of children being left behind, if really necessary in the worst cases, we have some directives that could come into play. So there's the directive on combating trafficking in human beings and protecting its victims, the directive on combating the sexual abuse and exploitation of children, and finally the 2012 directive on establishing minimum standards on the rights, support and protection of victims of crime. With regard to implementation of the recommendation, I think if all of us fulfil our roles and are aware of the legislative and policy framework in place, including the Europe 2020 targets and the country-specific recommendations on children that have been and will be further developed, we can do a lot. Civil society can play a role in awareness raising, in continuing to monitor the issue, and in contributing to implementation of the EU cohesion policy, and in contributing directly to implementation of the recommendation. And also by using the EPIC platform and making sure it's a dynamic and useful tool.